The myth goes that Hitler defined National Socialism, and while he certainly shaped it, in reality National Socialism was created by those that came before him, most especially the forgotten early member of the movement, Rudolf Jung. Rudolf Jung was the first National Socialist to write a book on National Socialism, and he wrote it before Hitler even discovered the party. Unlike Mein Kampf, it's actually readable, and it reveals a lot of interesting things about the early National Socialist movement, including its origins. It was from Jung that I discovered Hitler's God, as talked about in my video on that. So in today's video, we're going to take a look at who Rudolf Jung was, what he said, what he did, and see how much he influenced Hitler and the National Socialist movement altogether. Rudolf Jung was born in the Austro-Hungarian Empire at a place called Plas. Today it's called Plassy, a small town with about 3,000 inhabitants. The most important thing about this town is that it is centred around a former monastery, which was closed down in 1785, but the building itself is still there. I say this because anyone reading Rudolf Jung's book will very quickly see just how fanatically religious this person was, and it's clear that religion was a big part of the town that he came from, even if the monastery wasn't operational. Rudolf Jung spent most of his childhood in the city of Iglau, modern-day Jihlava, which at the time was a German-speaking city in the heart of a region dominated by the Czechs. This led to racial tensions and competition between the German and Czech workers in the town, all of which would influence Jung's views as he grew up. Now, it's worth just giving a bit of context here. Austria-Hungary was a multinational empire, sometimes referred to as a multi-ethnic empire, with 11 recognised nationalities that was split into two states, Austria and Hungary. The monarchy had an increasingly fragile grip on the empire, which had not only lost two wars in 1859 and 1866, but was also the cause of the increasingly explosive ethnic tensions. Franz Josef's absolutism was the incubator of nationalism. Before 1848, nationality had been just one social bond among many, vying with religion, region and kindred, and whether a noble peasant, townsman or priest. Now it became the predominant force, its potency enhanced by an oppressive regime bent on centralization and uniformity. As individual lives were swept up into bureaucratic categories, more and more became seen through the prism of nationality. Where several nationalities lived side by side, relations were often marked by competition, with rival choirs, fire brigades, parishes, athletics clubs, savings banks, veterans associations and schools. From the 1890s, bitter disputes about language rights in ethnically mixed areas increasingly paralysed the Austrian parliament. A crisis erupted in 1897 when Minister-President Count Badeni decreed that officials in Bohemia and Moravia should learn both Czech and German within 3 years, so they could communicate with all the peoples of these lands. Parliamentary session descended into farce, as in protest, German deputies obstructed legislation with speeches that lasted hours, while the Czechs, who favoured the measure, tried to drown them out by shouting, banging on desks, or playing musical instruments. In Prague, the university split down the middle into German and Czech sections. Only the botanical garden remained common to both, since the names of the plants were written in Latin. The opening of an Italian language law faculty at Innsbruck University in 1904 prompted riots by German students, which forced its closure. In Bohemia, another centre of national conflict, political tensions prompted Czechs and Germans to boycott each other's shops and businesses in 1898, 1908 and 1910. The extreme Czech National Socialist Party organised the Czech boycotters. Hopefully that gives you enough context to understand the world that Rudolf Jung was born into. Jung went to study at Vienna's Technical High School, earning himself a doctorate in mechanical engineering in 1906, and then worked for the Austrian North-Western Railways, which was nationalised in 1908, leading to its decline. It was in this period that Jung's political activism began, since the nationalised railways were heavily unionised and divided among racial lines. The conditions in the railways did nothing but reinforce the views Jung had been forming since his childhood in Iglau, that Czech immigration was being used to undercut German labour with cheap wages, deliberately forcing Germans to emigrate from their native lands in search of better working conditions. It is likely also that Jung's social views were further shaped by the proletarian culture of this heavily unionised environment and the many working-class railway employees whom he encountered. He was punished by his employers for his activism and was transferred away from Vienna back to Bohemia. But it was there that he discovered the German Workers' Party in Austria, probably joining it in 1909. This was a minor political party founded in Trnava in 1904 by disgruntled nationalist workers who had become disillusioned with the internationalist pro-Czech stance of social democracy and the Marxist unions. The DAPO was tailor-made for Jung's worldview, with its programme presenting a synthesis of Völkisch nationalism and reformist socialism, which agitated as much against the Czechs as it did for the liberation of the working classes of the German people. In 1913, Rudolf Jung and another member, Dr. Walter Riehl, a former Social Democrat, drafted the party's programme, the Iglau Program. This advocated policies that could be classed as both racially Völkisch and socialist. This new agenda was a radical shift from the earlier Trautenau programme, explicitly renouncing Marxism and intensifying its focus on anti-Slavic and anti-Semitic sentiments. The Iglau programme championed a variant of socialism that was national in scope, positioning itself as a genuine alternative to the then prevalent internationalist Marxism. It called for the expansion of German territories to safeguard this vision of socialism and included demands for pan-Germanism, the socialization of monopolies, the elimination of unearned incomes, and a unified stance against Slavs, Jews, capitalism, clericalism, and Marxism within the German community. This programme became the cornerstone for Jung's subsequent ideas and significantly influenced the evolution of the National Socialist movement. Jung was sacked from the railways in 1910, which allowed him to dedicate his time to the German Workers' Party in Austria-Hungary. But the Great War broke out in 1914, and this soon led to the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Rudolf Jung introduced the motto, Gemeinnutz geht vor Eigennutz, the common good comes before self-interest, laying a foundational principle of National Socialist ideology that persisted until 1945. During the period of the Austro-Hungarian Empire's collapse, on the 5th of May 1918, the party met in Vienna and voted on a new name. It was now called the German National Socialist Workers' Party, the DNSAP. Rudolf Jung was the one who wrote the party's new programme. This new Vienna programme called for, among other things, an expansion of the cooperative system, the nationalisation of large-scale enterprises, a democratically administered People's Bank, and the consolidation of the entire area of German settlement in Europe into a democratic social German Reich. Many of the programme's proposals would be expanded upon the following year in the first edition of Jung's book on National Socialist ideology, Der Nationale Sozialismus. It was this work, in combination with the Vienna programme and the body of published theoretical documents which he already had to his name, which helped cement Jung's reputation within the movement as National Socialism's chief ideologist, something of which he was quite proud. Jung's stated ambition, according to those who knew him, was to be the Karl Marx of National Socialism. Due to the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the party split into three different groups, one in Austria, one in Czechoslovakia, and one in Poland. Due to citizenship issues, Jung ended up in the Czechoslovakian portion of the party, serving as the party's second chairman from 1919 to 1926, and its first chairman from 1926 to 1933. He was also the parliamentary leader of the party's elected members in the Czechoslovakian National Assembly. But because Jung focused on reformism and running for parliament, this caused tensions within the party. And we've seen this before with the Social Democratic Party, who had to deal with this problem of reform versus revolution. We've also seen it with Hitler and Ernst Röhm, the peaceful revolution versus the violent revolution. These are concepts that have divided the various socialist movements since the days of Karl Marx and Bernstein. So now we've heard about Rudolf Jung's early life, let's take a look at the incredibly important book he wrote, which had the title The National Socialism, An Introduction to Its Foundations and Its Goals. There were 3 editions of this book, the first one published in the summer of 1919 before Hitler joined the movement. But finding copies of this first edition is difficult, and so I'm having to use the second edition from 1922, which was modified from the original. Still, even this edition predates Mein Kampf by 3 years, and the reason why it was written was because the National Socialist movement was thus growing in size, and thus naturally also growing more intellectually diverse and complex. There was clearly a need for greater unity of thought and purpose, which Jung, who had played a key role at the Salzburg Congress, would certainly have recognised. Drexler was still in charge of the NSDAP, but Hitler blocked the process of merging their party with the DSP, seeing it as a threat to his own leadership. He resigned, demanding that he become the true leader of the party with dictatorial powers. Rudolf Jung was involved in this dispute and others, and during this time divisions on ideology and tactics resulted in splits in the movement, and Rudolf Jung realised that his book needed to be expanded, and that some of the theoretical issues needed to be resolved so that the various National Socialist parties had a more solid foundation. Essentially, Jung hoped that his book could unite the factions that split the movement. The various German national labour groups exhausted themselves in endless, venomous arguments that confused their followers. It should be kept in mind, however, that the second edition of Der Nationale Sozialismus, published at the beginning of 1922, is not an anti-Hitler polemic. Despite their organisational and ideological differences, Hitler and Jung still shared the same basic worldview and would have agreed on more issues than they disagreed, and Jung had undeniably helped influence Hitler's own political beliefs. Regardless of any internal bickering over mergers, points of theory, or electoral participation, which Hitler at this time was resolutely against, the 2 men remained colleagues, maintaining a correspondence and continuing to make joint appearances together at various events. At this time, though, Hitler, despite his mounting influence within the movement, was still just one National Socialist leader among many, and it makes sense that Jung, who still had a higher profile among grassroots supporters, felt the need to reiterate the essentials of his own ideological interpretation of National Socialism in light of the recent disruptions. By 1923, however, Hitler's influence in the party had grown, and the DSP had collapsed, resulting in its members joining the NSDAP. And because their propaganda had been very effective, it resulted in substantial membership gains in Bavaria, and so Hitler's party was now the dominant party within the movement. In fact, at a National Socialist Congress in Vienna in 1922, Hitler was proclaimed the German Reichsführer. Rudolf Jung himself was there, and he also bowed to Hitler's leadership. And so the third edition of Rudolf Jung's book, released in 1923, was dedicated to Adolf Hitler. Jung had effectively rewritten it, with huge differences in the text compared to the second edition. Notably, the chapter containing the history of the National Socialist movement, which barely even mentioned the NSDAP in the second edition, was changed in the third to say that the entire movement was building up to be led by Hitler and the NSDAP. The third edition of Jung's book thus marks the shift from pre-Hitlerian National Socialism to the dominance of Hitlerism, highlighting the second edition's importance to our understanding of the ideology's original tenets and evolution. For this reason, we're going to look at the second edition of this book, and what exactly does Jung say in it? Well, first he gives a brief history of Germany and the German Volk, lamenting that Germany had never been united as a people. Jung articulates a vision of German history where the medieval peasant life, idealized for its harmony, was eroded by foreign influences. He nostalgically recalls a Teutonic golden age where German society was defined by an inherent racial purity, the German spirit, epitomized by the communal and culturally rich lives of tribal peasants and artisans deeply connected to their land. Jung argues that the introduction of Roman law, with its abstract and oriental origins, and capitalism imbued with a Jewish spirit, initiated a decline in this idyllic social order. Germany as a country, says Jung, had always been international in makeup, with a split between the Roman and Lutheran churches from the Reformation onwards, causing an inclination towards a small Germany, a Kleindeutschland. We could never become completely German in the sense that the French are French and the Czechs are Czech, because we have always been primarily either Catholic or Protestant. Neither of the two is German in the depths of its heart. I understand why people say that Hitler was a Christian, but they're missing this crucial point, and we'll see more of this going forward. The discovery of America ushered in the age of capitalism, characterized by the transition from a needs and barter-based economy to the monetary economy. The landed nobility, with the exception of the great landowners, became impoverished, but the citizens of the cities became rich through trade. So began the rule of money and interest. Jung criticizes Roman law for replacing the Germanic tradition of natural law, which was organically derived from the people and the land, with a state-derived system that alienated the law from the German populace. He saw capitalism as exasperating this disconnection, with industrialization displacing peasants and diminishing artisans' creative capacities, thereby fostering division and strife within society. He identified various modern elements, usury, the banking system, foreign capital, liberal democracy, and Marxism, as accomplices in this degradation, facilitating exploitation and division in pursuit of wealth and power. Germany is likened to a body which is torn apart by the various wars, including the 30 Years' War. Germany was only united under Bismarck, and Jung says that Germany was denied the freedom to determine its national affiliation. For Jung, this explains why the Germans were split into different countries, or even provinces, and why the Sudetengermans were facing the Slavs to their east. This is, in fact, a crucial point in understanding National Socialism. The Sudetengermans were looking to Greater Germany to their west, craving to become a part of a big Germany, Großdeutschland. But they were cut off from Germany by being part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and this is why Jung was against the idea of Christianity. He wanted a united German religion that could bring all the Germans together. We'll come back to this point shortly. But Jung and the Sudetengermans were also in conflict with the Czechs and Slavs to their east, which not only explains the racism and the desire to join a Greater Germany, and why the movement started where it did, but also goes some way in explaining why the concept of Lebensraum, living space, was such a pillar of the movement. Previously, I was under the impression that the concept of Lebensraum was introduced to the movement via Rudolf Hess, whose teacher was Karl Haushofer. In fact, that's what Ian Kershaw says in his popular biography of Hitler. It seems likely that Haushofer's works were one significant source for Hitler's notion of Lebensraum. Through Rudolf Hess, Hitler already knew Karl Haushofer, the leading exponent of geopolitics, by 1922 at the latest. Haushofer's influence was probably greater than the Munich professor was later prepared to acknowledge. If he was not acquainted with them before, Hitler certainly had time on his hands while in prison to read his works, as well as those of Friedrich Ratzel, the other foremost geopolitics theorist. Friedrich Ratzel was the one who coined the term Lebensraum in the first place. But it turns out that Rudolf Jung wrote about the concept of Lebensraum in his book in 1922, probably getting this idea from Ratzel directly, not Haushofer. I'm not sure if he wrote about Lebensraum in his first edition in 1919, but the fact that it's in the second edition, published in early 1922, means that it likely predates Haushofer's influence on Hitler and certainly over the wider movement. And just thinking about it logically, it now makes sense why National Socialism, which was born in the Sudetenland, was so obsessed with expanding to the east for living space, Lebensraum. Germany was in the west, the enemy, which was the Slavs, was to the east, so it was natural for them to assume that expansion should be eastwards against the Slavs, not in any other direction. The Sudetenland of Old Austria was the cradle of German National Socialism. The German National Socialist movement arose in the conflict-ridden region of the Sudetenland, born from ethnic struggle. Over time, its objectives also became economic struggle and, in conjunction with it, spiritual struggle. At the end of the 1880s, local German national workers and journeymen's associations appeared. Present at the birth of the German national labour movement were the journeyman bookbinder Ludwig Vogel, who passed away 30 years ago, and the typesetter Ferdinand Buchowski, who, as our eldest, is still active in the movement today, currently a city councillor and typesetter in the North Moravian township of Hohenstadt. Ferdinand Buchowski was the founder of the German Workers' Party in 1903, which later became the DNSAP, the German National Socialist Workers' Party. But it was Franco Stein and his apprentice Ludwig Vogel who founded the German National Workers' Association in 1893, the same year Hermann Göring was born. This appears to be the earliest German National Socialist entity in existence, even predating the Czech National Socialist Party in 1897. And so it's Franco Stein and Ludwig Vogel who are the originators of the movement. Wikipedia describes the association as a collection of labourers, apprentices, and trade unionists from the railroads, mines, and textile industries. This is supported by historian Brigitte Hamann in Hitler's Vienna, who confirms that Franz Stein, same person, just different spelling, was the one who founded the German National Workers' Association. Georg von Schunerer directed Franco Stein to build a pan-German labour movement and to win over German voters from the despised International and Jewish Social Democrats. Politically, as might be expected, the movement ended up in the orbit of the Pan-German Party under Schunerer. The only politician of repute with a genuine understanding for the situation of his poorer folk comrades was Georg Schunerer, who passed away in 1921. He, who was the primary trailblazer of the Volkisch movement, will always be held by us in the highest esteem. Schunerer was a massive anti-Semite, and it's probably from him that the National Socialist movement got its anti-Semitism from. He was also called the leader, the Führer, by his followers, which is where the term was introduced into the movement. Franco Stein pleaded with his employers and workers alike to overcome class differences. At a time when we are under such serious pressure from all sides, Czechs, Poles, Slovenians, Italians, etc., every single person has to do his duty to the service of his people, no matter whether he is a factory owner or a worker, a scholar or a farmer, a merchant or a tradesman, and, with German strength and German courage, we will over time succeed in demolishing the International Social Democratic Party under its Jewish leadership. Hitler became aware of Stein's work when he was in Vienna, and so the influence was there early on. So, along with these other sources, Rudolf Jung confirms that National Socialism was founded as a trade unionist movement in the Sudetenland. This was a syndicalist movement, and it was right from the beginning. I've shown this before in other videos, like my video on Hitler's socialism, but this again provides even more evidence that refutes the claim that National Socialism was not socialist. The unedifying conditions in the Pan-German movement, which was originally conceived as a grassroots movement, inevitably led to the evolution of a unique political and trade unionist tendency. This tendency reached its consummation in 1904 with the founding of the German Workers' Party. In its principles, the thus named Trautenau Program, the party demanded, as the National Socialists do today, a partial socialization in the form of economic nationalization and provincialization. One would, therefore, be perfectly correct in regarding this program as a socialist one. It's interesting because practically every book on Hitler or National Socialism starts with Hitler himself, or Karl Marx and Anton Drexler, who founded the German Workers' Party in Munich. They may even mention that its origins were in the wider Völkisch movement, or hint at an Austrian or Sudeten-German influence, but that's about it. If you're lucky, you may be told about the Thule Society, the occult, or the Pan-German movement. But all of these paint the picture that Hitler joined the German Workers' Party, and that it was him who changed the name to the National Socialist German Workers' Party, as if it was on a whim. These historians fail to mention that National Socialism, both as a term and a concept, predates Hitler, and was already in the movement. And the question is, why? Well, I'm not sure. If you guys could let me know why you think these left-leaning historians from the socialist state central bank funded academic institutions would categorically fail to even mention that National Socialism emerged from the socialist trade union syndicalist movement in the Sudetenland, and that by not explaining this, they have opened the door for socialists everywhere to declare that Hitler only put socialism in the name to trick the workers, and then they can deny the copious amounts of socialist and trade union policies that were enacted in the Third Reich. Yeah, if you could let me know why you think they did this, that would be great. Because I don't want to come to the blatantly obvious conclusion that academia is full of Marxist ideologues and then be called a conspiracy theorist again by the socialists on r/badhistory on Reddit. The private economy can never be wholly or violently abolished, yet all forms of social property should exist alongside it and be increasingly expanded. We advocate unconditionally for all large-scale capitalist enterprises which constitute private monopolies to be transferred into the possession of the state, province, Völkisch self-governing bodies, or municipality. We see the guiding principles for future progress in the purposeful conversion of all others into cooperative property by steadily increasing the profit sharing of all those who work within them, whether physically or intellectually. The National Socialist Workers' Party is no narrow class party. It represents the interest of all honest, productive labour in general. It is a liberal and strictly Völkisch party, and hence combats all reactionary tendencies, all clerical, noble and capitalist privileges, and every racially foreign influence. But above all, it combats the overwhelming power of the Jewish commercial spirit in all areas of public life. The influence of work and skill in state and society is our goal. The economic and political unity of the working German Volk, the means to this end. These exact ideas were championed by Hitler, and when he got into power, that's exactly what he did. He synchronized the economy with the state under the policy of Gleichschaltung. I've been over this so many times now that I'm just not going to go over it again, but if you're new here, check out these videos on the screen now for more information on Hitler's socialism. But what Rudolf Jung has just said about the Jewish commercial spirit was something also echoed by Hitler, and he explains why throughout his book. It's actually a huge portion of it. To boil it down into its core components, Jung says that metal money was an ancient institution, which was bad. Germanic legend professed that gold is laden with a curse. Murder and violent acts of all kinds are bound to it. Streams of blood have flowed on its account across every age, from antiquity to the present day. But he says that the Jews loved money and were permitted to charge interest against non-Jews, sometimes as high as 173%, which he classed as nothing other than thievery. Or you could just spend within your means and not get into debt in the first place, just saying. The enormous rate of interest can only be explained by the fact that money was rare. The Jew had it, always strived after possessions with it, and availed himself of both to the fullest. The profits which he derived from it did not allow others any peace. The Jewish spirit was a contaminant, and so alongside the Jewish usurer, the Aryan usurer appeared, although at first only sporadically. Thus was the transition to modern capitalism auspiciously heralded at the denouement of the Middle Ages. Naked robbery of land on the one hand, as we saw earlier, and usurious interest on the other. Truly a wonderful development, and even lovelier was the offspring which ultimately sprang from the union of the two, the B-word child, Mammonism. Thank you, YouTube censorship. Mammon, if you're not aware, is the Hebrew word for money. And because this word, mammon, was in the Bible, many Christians, anti-Semites, and even Karl Marx have associated money, mammon, with the Jews. What is the worldly cult of the Jew? Huckstering. What is his worldly god? Money. Money is the jealous god of Israel, besides which no other god may exist. For the love of money is the root of all evil, which while some covet it after, they have erred from the faith and pierced themselves through with many sorrows. Christ drove the Jewish money changers out of the temple, and that the money changers of our age enlisted on the side of tyranny happen again to be Jews is perhaps no more than a historic coincidence. No man can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or else he will hold to the one and despise the other. Ye cannot serve God and Mammon. Wow, why is that? Why is the Bible against money? Love not the world, neither the things that are in the world. If any man love the world, the love of the Father is not in him. The idea of Christianity, at least in its original Catholic conception, is that this material plane of existence is bad. It's evil, it's corrupt, and those who worship materialism are all sinners. That's why pride, gluttony, material possessions, and even selfishness are sins, because these are material things. What you should be doing, says Christianity, is looking higher to God, who exists beyond this material realm in a spiritual plane, heaven. So anyone who worships money is seen as bad. You're chasing materialism and forsaking God. Therefore, the Bible says, be poor. Don't chase money or material things, and if you do happen to get some, give it away. Charity is a virtue after all. This is why Rudolf Jung hates interest rates, sometimes called usury, the lending of money and charging interest. Karl Marx hates it too, even saying in Das Kapital that money begets money. Usury centralises money wealth where the means of production are dispersed. It does not alter the mode of production, but attaches itself firmly to it like a parasite and makes it wretched. It sucks out its blood, enervates it, and compels reproduction to proceed under ever more pitiable conditions. Hence, the popular hatred against usurers, which was most pronounced in the ancient world. And like Rudolf Jung also does, Marx quotes from Martin Luther. They turn buying also into usury, but this is really too much to bite off at once. We must first confine ourselves to one thing, usury in lending, and after we have stopped that after Judgment Day, we shall not fail to preach against usury in buying. I'm not sure, but I think what he means is that if you buy something and it goes up in price, then sell it, the profit you've made from that is usury in buying. So it's basically capital gains. This is in contrast to normal usury, which is when you lend out money and charge interest. Well, due to historic circumstances, which Jung acknowledges himself, though he disagrees, the Jews were associated with money, mammon. This is why Martin Luther himself hated the Jews, as acknowledged by Rudolf Jung. Trust no fox on the wide heath, and no Jew upon his oath. Thus we see Mammonism at work. Its mission is the subjugation of productive circles under the all-pervading power of money, and the shallow materialism of our age serves as its breeding ground, but its driving force is the Jewish spirit. That which all of these sub-movements consciously or unconsciously fight against: selfishness and egotism, greed and avarice, materialism. Our movement has long since clearly recognised as the enemy and has already forged the weapons for their conquest. This point is echoed throughout Mein Kampf. As soon as the spirit of egotism begins to prevail among a people, then the bonds of the social order break, and man, by seeking his own personal happiness, veritably tumbles out of heaven and falls into hell. But back to Jung. The concept of renewal is directly firmly against materialism, the greatest enemy of our folk. Renewal, eh? Is this Hegelianism seeping into the ideology again? Socialism and materialism are, after all, simply incompatible because the former is the highest altruism, while the latter is the most flagrant egotism. And so socialism built upon materialism again ends only in individualism. This is actually incredibly important. The philosophy behind Marxist socialism is called dialectical materialism. It's a form of materialism, which is why they advocate the stealing of money from the bourgeoisie in a violent revolution, aka murder and theft. Well, Rudolf Jung points out that Marxist socialism cannot be socialism, since it's based on materialism and therefore must be individualism, not collectivism. You cannot be socialist if you're an individualist, only a collectivist, which the Marxists are not because they're materialists. Whoever loves their own folk should certainly not be constantly exaggerating its existing weaknesses while intentionally minimising or even denying the faults of all others, as the Marxists have done since the beginning. But neither should they, and this is their cardinal sin, place the craving for wealth and possessions at the forefront of all their considerations, and deliberately discourage the good instincts of the masses of the Volk. So, as Rudolf Jung and later Hitler point out, National Socialism isn't against Marxism because Marxism is socialist. They're against Marxism because it's not socialist. If its cardinal sin is the advocation of materialism, capitalism, how can you possibly class it as socialism? A true socialism would not be based on capitalist materialism. And Jung and Hitler both argue that the reason Marxism had betrayed socialism was because, in their minds, it was infiltrated by the Jews, who were capitalist materialists at heart. Included in their number are the leaders of the bourgeoisie, and since Bebel's death, the only great leader which Marxism ever produced in Germany, also those of social democracy. Incapable of conceiving of a grand new idea and of putting it into practice themselves, they instead paddle about in Jewry's wake, thus representing a thoroughly un-German international. Their spiritual leader is the born internationalist, the Jew. The struggle should therefore be directed against them first and foremost if the free social pan-Germany is to arise. Its objective, therefore, is the struggle against selfishness, to be replaced by selflessness. Two elements thus make up its core: liberation from the Jewish spirit and the quest for that expression of spiritual feeling which is most appropriate for our folk. So National Socialism, according to the National Socialists themselves, is waging a spiritual battle against the forces of Jewry, which they class as money, mammonism, selfishness, capitalism, Marxism, and materialism. Jung differentiated between this creative national capital and destructive finance capital, the latter being non-productive and predicated on exploitative practices for profit generation. A core objective of National Socialism, according to Jung, was the eradication of the destructive aspects of finance capital and Mammonism to pave the way for a Germany founded on a collective labour ethos and respect for work. Jung positioned National Socialism as the sole path to redemption for the German worker, critiquing Social Democrats for their neglect of German interests in favour of Czech minorities in Austria and the Sudetenland, and for their internationalist stance that overlooked the menace of Jewish finance capital. He dismissed social democracy as alien, overly materialistic, and under undue Jewish influence, incapable of fostering a true Volksgemeinschaft, people's community. In his view, only a national variant of socialism could cultivate such a community. This then leads us to another important aspect of Jung's book, which does have its influence on Hitler. According to Jung, Christianity itself, at least in its current form, is international by nature, and by that he means interracial and Jewish. Christianity, says Jung, was against the spirit of National Socialism. Jung even says that the Jewish spirit of Christian socialism, or clericalism, had the goal of re-establishing the Spanish Roman Papal Church. This, he says, weakens the German Volk. And as an aside, he says that the Freemasons have a similar mission. One thing is indisputable, that Church Christianity represents an invaluable ally for the Jews. It has taken the teachings of Jesus the Galilean, the content of which comprised the most supreme selflessness and a belief in the benevolent Father in heaven, the All-Father, and has garnished them with various ingredients sourced from the racial mishmash dwelling in Western Asia and on the shores of the Mediterranean Sea. It has also associated these teachings, which constitute a revolt against Judaism and its spirit, with the Old Testament, the same Old Testament in which the Jewish spirit finds its purest expression. Furthermore, it has equated the All-Father of the Saviour with the Jewish God Yahweh, even though Jesus described Yahweh as follows. Your father, i.e. the Jewish God, is the devil. He was a criminal from the beginning, in whom there is no truth. Where he lies, he thus reveals his own nature, for he is the father of lies. But by passing along the fraud that is the belief in a single God, monotheism, as well as the fraudulent belief in the Jews as the children of God, Church Christendom has only helped the Jews, has only contributed to so many nations viewing them as God's chosen race, and willingly opening wide their doors to them. So he's now against monotheism as well. And so he goes on to say that what is needed is a new religion, not the current monotheistic version of Christianity. The monks who cleared the forests of Germania, the bishops of the Saxon and Stauffer periods, the secular knights and the Teutonic Order were all warlike in spite of their Christianity, because they felt this Christianity to be German. For that is what matters. Everything is embodied by exactly what you put into it yourself. Every person and every folk ultimately perceive the deity as corresponding to their own being. It is therefore entirely appropriate when we speak of a German God. Let us quietly leave the desert god Yahweh, that spirit of destruction, to the Jews. Ours is called the All-Father. As I explained in my video on Hitler's God, the German All-Father is the Nordic god called Odin, or Wotan. It was while reading Jung's book that I realised this, since most of the National Socialist texts are very secretive about their religion. Hitler doesn't outright state which god is his, and even though it may seem obvious now that I've spelled it out, backed by evidence, it wasn't clear beforehand. But some are still insistent that the National Socialists are Christians, even though the Christian God is the Jewish God Yahweh. And before anyone who's a Christian tries to deny this, the word Alleluia, which has Yah at the end of it, meaning Yahweh, literally means praise be Yahweh. This is why Rudolf Jung is against Christianity and calls for Germans to worship their own god, Odin, because he knows that the Christian God is the Jewish God. So I guess if you remove God from Christianity and replace him with Odin, and you get rid of the Old Testament and change most of the teachings of Christianity, and then change the cross to the hooked cross, and insert a bunch of runes and pagan symbols into the mix, then you could class it as Christian. But I, logically, can't class this as Christian because it's nowhere near. When we now speak of a German People's Church, we have in mind an amalgamation of the two churches spread out across German lands. This would have to involve a renunciation of Roman centralism, the internationalist spirit, and the Old Testament, those fundamentally Jewish entities, and would also have to be the work of German priests who love their Volk and are imbued with its spirit. To summarise, the Jewish spirit gives birth to materialism. This forms the foundation of Mammonism. Each makes our Volk unfree, both inwardly and outwardly. The concept of renewal, which strives for spiritual and psychological liberation from everything foreign, is directed against one. The other, Mammonism, we tackle with different weapons. Its central pillar is unearned income. This, therefore, has to be combated. He goes on to explain that the Germans are a productive race of labourers, while the Jews and other races are the opposite. They are moochers. He says that productive labour needs to protect itself from the moochers. The German National Socialist Party declares that it commits itself to the class standpoint of productive labour. It is therefore a class party. In its view, however, the concept of class does not encompass some narrowly defined occupational categories, such as physical and intellectual workers alone. Instead, workers are, according to its conception, all those who live from the earnings of their own honest, intellectual or physical labour. In other words, the entire mass of the economically vulnerable among our Volk. And because Germans always have been producers and always will remain so, and because we wish to be Germans true and proper, we consequently commit ourselves to the class standpoint of productive labour. Above all, it is imperative to protect the proceeds of labour from being seized by moochers, in order to prevent them from being diminished. I'd like to point out that Rudolf Jung's view here is challenged by the statistics. Of a total population of 84.5 million people in Germany, 14 million of them are under the age of 18. That leaves 70.5 million adults. Well, in July 2024, 5.63 million people in Germany were claiming benefits. A further 17.6 million received pension payments in 2021. So at least 23.23 million people were not working. That's 33% of the total adult population. Yes, a third of all adult Germans are unproductive. So no, the Germans are not a race of producers at all, and neither are the English, 16.1 million of whom are claiming to be disabled, which is 24% of the total population of England. Whoever does not work should also not eat. Only work, honest work, confers value and dignity upon people. We should judge our fellow men only by his measure. Okay, so according to the Nazis, we should starve millions of pensioners and children. And we should also starve the modern-day Nazis too, since many of them are bone idle as well. The irony, of course, is that the National Socialists are all about the welfare state, giving money to people who don't work, like the unemployed, the bureaucrats, or the civil servants and the politicians. But yeah, technically, they don't like you if you don't work, and they see themselves as a productive race, even though they're not. And of course, this is where they start to contradict themselves. Fair pay is that which in the first instance allocates the honest worker with enough that he can live without concern over food and housing, without having to worry about the size of his family increasing, without fear of illness and death. Apparently they're going to abolish death now. Universal basic inflation abolishes death. More news at 10. Fair pay is that which does not engender misery over unemployment, over a reduction or loss of one's capacity for work. So they're all about productive workers and starving the unproductive, but if you're made unemployed or disabled, then fair pay will compensate you. I mean, that's a contradiction that makes absolutely no sense. How is it fair that someone who's not productive gets paid the same as someone who does work? That's not fair. Also, if some benefit scrounger spends all his time having 75 kids, why should he get more money for that? Why should the rest of society give money to someone just because they keep having children? That's not fair pay at all. But fair pay is not just about money. Yes it is. Jung has ranted and raved about how mammon is bad, and yet here he is quoting from a party comrade craving it. Are the National Socialists demanding more money because they haven't got any? Yeah. Is it because they're too busy ranting and raving that they can't hold down a job? Yeah. And it's absolutely unsurprising to me that poverty-stricken preachers like Jung and his party comrades are so against materialism. But then they all turn around with an open palm and demand the very material they spend their days chastising. How very hypocritical of them. And if you think about it, productivity is what? Materialism. What are you producing? Material things. So we've had this massive rant about materialism, which takes up most of the book, and then he just flips the script and starts praising it, saying that the most productive and therefore most materialistic people on the planet are the Aryans. And this is where the whole thing just collapses in on itself, as it always does when socialists start talking about economics. If selfishness is so bad, then how can the worker who selfishly demands more pay be good? Why is it morally right to selfishly sit on benefits as other people slave away for you? Why should the beggar selfishly hold out his hand? Why is the virtuous and amazing priest that the rest of us have to bow down to demanding you put mammon in the hat? Again, the whole thing, altruistic morality, just doesn't make any sense when you stop and think about it. Fair pay is not just about money. It also takes purchase value into consideration, anticipating the expenses which the worker has to meet out of his wages. Fair pay does not involve remunerating everyone equally. The higher in value the work is for the community, the more difficult and demanding it is. The more skills and qualifications which it requires, the higher the just reward must be. Now, first off, you're not rewarded for how hard you work. No, you're not. You're rewarded for how much value you provide for society. That's what profit is. Profit is merely the calculation for how much value you have provided for other people. Not making much money? That's because you're not providing value to other people. That's why you're poor, because you're not providing anything that anyone wants, or very little of it. And notice I said providing, not producing. If you find a diamond in the street, you could make money by selling that, providing value to society. So it's not about working hard, it's about working smart. And how do you calculate value? Via the free market. Without free market prices, you cannot have economic calculation. So as soon as you start artificially manipulating wages, you can no longer calculate the value that work has for the community. All this talk about fair pay goes out the window once you realise that there's no such thing in the first place. And even if there was, as soon as you manipulate the wages to try and make it happen, you're instantly unable to calculate it. Of course, just like the Marxists, Jung believes in the labour theory of value, which was debunked in 1868 with the Marginal Revolution, and so he doesn't realise the flaws in his own theory. And this is why I'm not going to repeat all his arguments, because I'll just end up, debunking socialism again. In a nutshell, Rudolf Jung goes on to argue for fair pay, land reform on similar lines to Henry George of Georgism, whom he says was the original founder of land reform. He says, borrowing from George, that the National Socialists do not need to confiscate the land, they only need to confiscate the rents from the land. The German National Socialist Party views today's land law and interest slavery as the source of the social evils of our age, evils whose elimination it strives for with every possible means. It is, and always has been, of the view that one must return to the old Germanic outlook, according to which land and soil can ideally only be the property of the Volk, while the individual solely possesses that which he has built and earned himself. This does not mean that the working peasant loses his land, but that usurious land speculation is done away with. So here we can see where Hitler gets his ideas from, since this is how he approached the economics of the Third Reich. And just to point out that Rudolf Jung quotes a lot from the Bible and Martin Luther, and of course Luther had a table talk which is probably the inspiration for Hitler's table talks. In addition to Martin Luther and Henry George, Jung was influenced by people like Friedrich List, Max Wundt, Oswald Spengler, whom he quotes a few times. A quote from Spengler actually starts the book. Houston Stewart Chamberlain, Werner Sombart, Gottfried Feder, in the 1922 edition at least, and Otto Bauer. Yep, the same Bauer that Karl Marx wrote his On the Jewish Question against. What Dr. Bauer here preaches is nothing more and nothing less than the bankruptcy of Marxism. Rudolf Jung had a profound influence on Hitler himself. As mentioned before, the two appeared together at gatherings, and it's clear that Jung's book, the first on National Socialism, was an inspiration for Hitler. This poster, for example, announces a joint meeting by Hitler and Jung in 1922. Jung came to visit Hitler in Landsberg prison, and I have noticed certain sections of Mein Kampf which I'm sure are plagiarised from Rudolf Jung's book or are answering him. The similarities on page 33 of Jung's book with certain sections of Mein Kampf are striking. I was going to go through the quotes where Jung says that the Jews are nomads and who have no ideals, and Hitler responds by saying that they don't have a spirit of idealism, so they aren't nomads, but rather parasites living off others. And Jung says that they are a religious community, but Hitler says that's a lie. Their religion masks their race. However, this video is getting long, so I'm just going to skip all that. But it's clear that parts of Mein Kampf are an answer to Rudolf Jung's book, which not only shows that he was a big player in National Socialism in the early days, but that Mein Kampf was written for the insiders of the movement in response to other intellectuals in the movement. And this leads us to the next point, Jung's fall from grace. By 1923, Hitler's NSDAP had grown larger than the other parties in Austria, Czechoslovakia and Poland, and its influence also affected Jung's party. By early 1922, Hitler had consolidated his leadership within the NSDAP, eliminating any internal party democracy. In contrast, Jung maintained a democratic approach within the DNSAP, where members elected party leaders and policies were decided through discussions and voting. Jung was intellectually prepared to acknowledge Hitler as his leader, but found it challenging to completely submit to Hitler's authority. The Czech state cracked down on the DNSAP, which was compelled to disband in September 1923. After serving a 7-month prison sentence, Jung went to Germany, where he was granted party membership in November 1935 and received official recognition as being an alter Kämpfer, an old fighter. And as a reward for his 30 years of service in the movement in 1938, even though he had been in the movement much longer than that, he was appointed as an honorary Gauleiter and an honorary member of the SS, becoming a SS Gruppenführer. But these official recognitions of his duty to the party didn't make up for the fact that Jung had become a minor player by this point. He was working in academia and in public service, but these were mid-level positions, and he had no real political influence at this time. Jung was acutely aware that his contributions had not been fully recognised, and that he lacked the same level of renown as other leaders from the movement's early days. For a man who had been with the National Socialist movement almost since its founding, who had been associated with National Socialism even before the Führer, and who had played an invaluable role in the development of the movement's ideology, this must have been particularly frustrating. Jung's craving for the recognition and status which he felt were commensurate with his prior achievements was noticed by his contemporaries, one of whom observed that he has an almost mimosa-like sensitivity with regards to his position and his rank and his name. His addiction to titles and his addiction to recognition of his personality seem downright pathological. Desiring more influence, he and his family returned to the Czech lands in 1943, hoping to secure a position as a Gauleiter or a mayor. Instead, he ended up working as the Reich Inspector for Labour Management. When the end of the war came, his family fled with his belongings, while he stayed in his office, where he was arrested by the Czech resistance on the 5th of May 1945, the day of the Prague Uprising. On December 11th, 1945, in a dank Czech prison cell, Rudolf Jung passed away. Some accounts say by YouTube censorship policies, others say by malnutrition and mistreatment. Whatever the cause, it was a sad end, can you tell this guy's a Nazi, for a man who had once been regarded among his peers as the Karl Marx of National Socialism, as the ideological leader and patron saint of an entirely new political worldview. Unlike so many other alter Kämpfer in the German Reich, in the last years of Jung's life there was no real public recognition of his accomplishments. His name graced no street or square or building, and there were no plaques or monuments or ceremonies in his honour. Today, he is virtually forgotten. Yet the role Jung played in the development of National Socialist ideology deserves recognition. So, Rudolf Jung was a major player in the early days of the National Socialist movement, writing the first book on National Socialism and helping to carve out its early doctrines, many of which ended up being policies in the Third Reich. But because the Austro-Hungarian Empire split up, their portion of the movement, the original portion, also became fragmented. Jung wrote his book in an attempt to bring them back together, which definitely helped, but by late 1922 Hitler's party had grown in popularity, overshadowing the rest, and Jung's influence declined from there on out. The fact is, though, that Hitler wasn't the originator of National Socialism. He may have shaped the ideology, but it wasn't defined by him. For political and economic reasons, the historians have largely failed to acknowledge where the movement started, and have neglected to talk about Rudolf Jung, which is clearly a mistake on their part. I think there's a few lessons to take away from this. The first is that we can't rely too heavily on our current academic institutions to give us an accurate history of what happened. We do have to do some reading ourselves. We must be vigilant and think critically with whatever it is that they're telling us. It's clear once again that National Socialism is a religion with an altruistic morality system which is also self-refuting. And it has its origins in the trade union movement in the multinational empire of Austria-Hungary. It predates Hitler. It does have occult Volkish roots, but it also is a trade union syndicalist movement with a socialist ideology. And while Hitler does change some of the ideas, he never moves away from this, as you can see in my other videos. For example, he didn't abolish the trade unions, he nationalised them, as I explained in my video on that. So check it out. Thanks for watching, bye for now.